The dessert boxes hit the cobblestones with a sound that made Skylar's heart stop, but she couldn't pause to mourn the ruined lemon tarts because Marcus's voice cut through the humid savannah air like a blade. She'd taken the delivery order specifically because it was across town from her apartment, far from anywhere he might look, but somehow he'd found her anyway. The Spanish moss hanging from ancient oaks created shadows that should have hidden her, yet his footsteps echoed closer with each passing second. Her sneakers slipped on the historic district's uneven stones as she clutched the one remaining box to her chest, the wedding cake topper inside more valuable than all the other desserts combined. Marcus had always been good at tracking her movements, a skill she'd once mistaken for attentiveness before understanding it as surveillance. The restraining order she'd filed meant nothing when the ink was barely dry, and enforcement required police who weren't already spread thin across the city. She could hear him calling her name with that particular tone that used to make her freeze in place, conditioned response from 2 years of slowly escalating control. He'd memorized her delivery routes, knew which clients ordered regularly, probably had been watching the bakery for weeks waiting for this exact opportunity. The panic rising in her chest made breathing difficult, each inhale feeling like it caught on broken glass lodged somewhere behind her ribs. The estate gates appeared before her like salvation wrapped in wrought iron, standing open to accommodate the steady stream of wedding guests in their formal attire. Security personnel flanked the entrance, but their attention was focused inward on the ceremony already in progress, not on the frightened young woman sprinting toward them. Skylar made a split-second calculation that crashing a stranger's wedding was infinitely preferable to whatever Marcus intended when he caught up with her. The guards noticed her too late to intercept as she darted past them into the manicured gardens, where hundreds of white chairs faced an elaborate floral arch. The ceremony was in full swing with a minister reading vows to a couple who radiated the kind of wealth that made Skylar's entire existence feel microscopic. The groom stood with his back to her approach, tall frame in a custom tuxedo that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Dark hair perfectly styled for the professional photographers. The bride was a vision in silk and lace, her expression of annoyed impatience visible even from a distance, as though this wedding was an obligation rather than celebration. Skylar's momentum carried her forward through a gap in the seating arrangement, just as the minister asked if anyone had objections to the union. Her foot caught on the edge of a decorative runner, and she stumbled forward with a grace that would have been comedic in any other circumstance. The cake topper box flew from her hands in a perfect arc that seemed to happen in slow motion while every head turned to witness her spectacular entrance. She crashed to her knees on the pristine white aisle runner, breathing hard from the sprint, hair escaping from its ponytail in wild strands that stuck to her sweat-dampened neck. The silence that followed her interruption was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of Marcus shouting her name from somewhere beyond the garden walls. The groom turned around, and Skylar found herself staring into eyes that were neither kind nor cruel, but intensely focused in a way that made her forget how to breathe. His face was angular and striking, the kind of masculine beauty that belonged on magazine covers, except for the hardness in his expression that suggested something dangerous lurking beneath expensive polish. Something passed between them in that suspended moment, recognition without prior meeting, as though they were both seeing someone they'd been expecting without knowing they were waiting. His gaze moved from her face to the garden entrance where Marcus's voice grew louder, then back to her, with an assessment that felt like being catalogued and filed. The bride's voice shattered the frozen tableau with an indignant demand for explanation, her cultured accent making each word sound like a slap. Guests erupted into whispered speculation that created a buzz of noise around the ceremony space, phones emerging from pockets to capture this scandal for social media immortality. The minister looked between the couple and the intruder with the helplessness of someone whose script had been thrown away mid-performance. Security personnel were moving now, converging on Skylar's position with professional efficiency, but the groom raised one hand in a gesture that stopped them as effectively as if he'd built a wall. Dave, though Skylar wouldn't learn his name until later, studied the situation with a calculation that was visible in the slight narrowing of his eyes. He saw Marcus appear at the garden entrance with security attempting to restrain him, saw the terror in Skylar's expression as she tried to scramble to her feet, saw his bride's fury and his guest's fascination. Something shifted in his posture, a decision being made in real time, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the assembled crowd with natural authority that demanded attention. The words he said next would later seem insane to everyone present, but in that moment, they felt inevitable. "The ceremony is over," Dave announced with finality that left no room for debate or discussion. His bride's expression transformed from annoyance to shock, then to something dangerous that promised future consequences for this public humiliation. The minister made a sound of protest that died when Dave's attention shifted to him briefly, whatever the man saw in that gaze enough to ensure his silence. Guests erupted into chaos, with some standing, others filming, all talking at once in a cacophony that made the gardens feel suddenly claustrophobic despite the open air. Dave moved down the aisle toward Skylar with measured steps that ate up distance while maintaining perfect composure, nothing in his movement suggesting hurry despite the urgency of the situation. He reached her just as security finally managed to restrain Marcus at the garden perimeter, the other man's struggles visible, but contained by professionals who knew their business. Dave extended his hand to Skylar not as offer, but as expectation that she would accept, his palm steady while she trembled from adrenaline and fear and complete disorientation. She took it without conscious thought, letting him pull her to her feet while the ruined cake topper lay forgotten on the white runner between them. "Come with me," he said quietly, words meant only for her ears, despite the audience of hundreds watching every moment. His grip on her hand was firm without being painful, possessive without being threatening, and Skylar felt herself being guided toward the estate's main building while chaos erupted behind them. The bride was screaming now, her family members trying to calm her while simultaneously demanding explanations from anyone in Dave's organization foolish enough to stand within shouting distance. Marcus's voice rose above the general noise, making threats that security absorbed with professional detachment while preventing him from advancing further into the property. The estate's interior was all high ceilings and old money, the kind of generational wealth that didn't need to announce itself because it was embedded in every architectural detail. Dave led her through a marble foyer where staff members pressed themselves against walls to avoid interfering with his passage, their deference suggesting this was a man whose requests were never refused. He opened a door to a library that smelled of leather and old books, ushering Skylar inside before closing them away from the chaos with a quiet click. The sudden silence was disorienting after the noise of the ruined ceremony, leaving only the sound of her ragged breathing and his controlled respiration. Skylar's mind was trying to catalog what had just happened, but the pieces wouldn't fit into any coherent narrative that made sense. She'd crashed a wedding while running from her ex-fiancé, caused a scene that would trend on social media within the hour, and somehow ended up alone with a groom who'd just called off his own ceremony. The room felt too small, despite its generous proportions. The walls lined with books that suggested a mind that valued knowledge, alongside the power his bearing clearly indicated. Dave moved to a sideboard and poured 2 glasses of something amber from a crystal decanter, his movements economical and precise. "You're safe here," he said without turning around, statement rather than reassurance, as though safety was something he could decree into existence through sheer force of will. Skylar found her voice finally, though it came out smaller than she intended, asking who he was and why he'd just destroyed his own wedding for a complete stranger. Dave turned to face her with both glasses in hand, offering one which she accepted automatically, despite not being sure she should drink anything in her current state. The glass was heavy crystal that warmed quickly in her shaking hands, the liquor inside smelling expensive and complex in ways she couldn't identify. "My name is Dave Moretti," he said, watching her face for recognition that came slowly, as the surname registered in her consciousness. Everyone in Savannah knew the Moretti name even if they pretended not to, the family's influence woven through the city's business landscape, in ways that were understood but never openly discussed. Skylar's grip on the glass tightened as she realized she'd stumbled into something far more complicated than a simple wedding interruption, that the man standing before her commanded power that made Marcus's threats seem suddenly insignificant by comparison. Dave watched Skylar process his identity with the clinical interest of someone accustomed to reading people's reactions for survival purposes rather than social niceties. Her face went through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, recognition, fear, then something more complicated that looked almost like relief, despite the logic that should have sent her running. The library's afternoon light caught the dust motes floating between them, creating an almost dreamlike quality to a situation that was anything but fantastical in its potential consequences. Outside the closed door, voices were rising in volume and urgency as the canceled wedding created ripples of chaos through what should have been a carefully orchestrated social event. Dave could hear his former bride Vanessa's fury even through the thick wood, her family's outrage mixing with confused guests and staff trying to manage a crisis without clear direction. His second in command would be handling the immediate fallout, But eventually Dave would need to face the consequences of a decision that had been purely instinctual rather than strategically calculated. Skylar finally found words that came out in a rush, apologizing for ruining his wedding and offering to explain everything to his bride if it would help salvage the situation. The earnestness in her voice was almost painful to witness. This young woman who'd just escaped danger still trying to fix problems that weren't her responsibility to solve. Dave raised one hand to stop her spiral of apologies, the gesture making her fall silent mid-sentence with a compliance that suggested unfortunate familiarity with being interrupted. The wedding was a business arrangement, not a love match, Dave said with the kind of brutal honesty he rarely employed outside his inner circle. Vanessa and I have known each other since childhood. Our family's expecting this union to cement certain alliances that benefit everyone's financial interests. She's aware of my world and accepts it because her family operates in similar spaces, though with more legitimate veneers covering their activities. The marriage would have been comfortable and mutually beneficial, but it was never going to be what most people mean when they use the word partnership. Skylar's expression shifted to something that might have been sympathy, if not for the wariness still evident in her posture and the way she kept glancing toward the door. She asked why he'd called it off then, if the arrangement served practical purposes, and both parties understood the terms of their agreement. Dave moved to one of the leather chairs positioned near the fireplace, gesturing for her to take the other, waiting until she perched on its edge before answering a question that deserved more consideration than he could fully articulate. Because I realized in that moment that I didn't want comfortable and mutually beneficial if it meant spending my life with someone who looked at our wedding like an inconvenient business meeting. Dave's voice carried no self-pity, just observation of facts as he understood them. Vanessa checked her phone 3 times during the ceremony before you arrived, annoyed that we were running behind schedule for her planned reception entrance. I've watched my parents live that kind of marriage and swore I wouldn't repeat their mistakes. Yet there I was about to do exactly that because it seemed like the logical choice. Skylar took a careful sip of the liquor he'd given her, the alcohol making her cough slightly before warmth spread through her chest in a way that eased some of the tension in her shoulders. She asked what he expected from her now, the question pragmatic in ways that suggested she'd learned not to expect help without strings attached. Dave appreciated the directness even as it confirmed suspicions about the man she'd been running from, the patterns of control that left marks invisible to casual observation. I expect you to tell me about the man who was chasing you, and why you're terrified enough to crash a stranger's wedding rather than face him, Dave said with calm that belied the anger building in his chest. Not anger at her, but at situations that forced young women to choose between dangerous options, because safe paths had been systematically cut off. Skylar's fingers tightened on her glass until her knuckles went white, her gaze dropping to the expensive carpet, as though the pattern there could provide answers she didn't want to speak aloud. Marcus was my fiancé until 6 months ago when I finally worked up the courage to leave him. She began in a voice that started steady, but wavered as details emerged. He seemed perfect at first, attentive, generous with his time, interested in my baking dreams in ways that felt supportive. It took almost a year before I noticed how his suggestions about my schedule were actually demands, how his concern about my friends was really isolation in disguise. The classic pattern, Dave thought but didn't say, letting her continue without interruption as the story spilled out in the halting rhythm of someone unused to being heard. Skylar described a relationship that had narrowed her world systematically, until leaving felt impossible, because Marcus had positioned himself as the only person who truly cared about her welfare. The bakery where she worked became her only refuge, the early morning hours when he was still sleeping her only guaranteed time alone. She'd finally left when he suggested they get married immediately, instead of waiting for the spring wedding they'd planned. His reasoning that they didn't need a big ceremony, because what mattered was commitment. Skylar had recognized the trap being set, the way a rushed marriage would give him legal claims to her time and decisions that would be harder to break. She'd packed while he was at work, left the ring on the kitchen counter, stayed with her co-worker Jenna for 3 days before finding her current apartment. The restraining order was supposed to keep him away, but Marcus had money for lawyers who knew how to delay enforcement while making her life difficult in ways that skirted legal boundaries. He showed up at the bakery claiming to be a customer until her boss threatened to ban him. He sent flowers to her apartment with cards that oscillated between apologies and accusations. He'd made complaints about her delivery vehicle being parked illegally, causing problems with her boss who was already skeptical about keeping someone with legal drama on staff. Today was supposed to be safe because the delivery address was in a neighborhood Marcus would never frequent, old money territory where his new tech wealth would be obvious and unwelcome. Skylar had no idea how he'd found her route, or why he'd chosen today to escalate, but the look in his eyes when she'd spotted him had made primitive survival instincts override all rational thought. Running toward the estate gates had been pure panic response, her brain offering no alternatives beyond immediate escape. Dave listened to the full accounting without interrupting, his expression giving nothing away, while his mind was already calculating solutions to problems that seemed insurmountable from Skylar's perspective. Marcus sounded like a dozen other men he'd encountered, the type who mistook possession for affection and couldn't tolerate losing control of what they considered their property. The restraining order would be worth enforcing once the right pressure was applied to the right people, but that was a temporary solution to a deeper problem. "What do you want to happen now?" Dave asked when she'd finished speaking, the question deliberately open-ended to gauge what she considered an acceptable outcome. Skylar looked up at him with eyes that were striking, even reddened from unshed tears, green-gray that reminded him of the ocean before a storm. Her answer, when it came, was delivered with fierce certainty that cut through her obvious fear. She wanted Marcus to leave her alone permanently, wanted to feel safe in her own city, wanted to build the bakery business she'd been planning since her grandmother taught her to bake. Dave recognized ambition when he heard it, the kind of determined dreaming that refused to die even when circumstances tried to crush it into submission. He made a decision that would complicate his life considerably, but felt more right than anything he'd done in years. "I can make Marcus disappear from your life," he said carefully, not as threat, but as statement of capability. Not literally disappear, but ensure he understands that pursuing you further will have consequences he's not prepared to face. Skylar's expression showed she understood what he was offering, came from a world she'd probably spent her whole life avoiding. She asked what such help would cost her, the question betraying familiarity with transactions that came with hidden prices. Dave respected her wariness even as it stung slightly, reminder that his reputation preceded him in ways that made genuine connection difficult. What he proposed next would sound insane if he gave her time to think about it rationally, so he pressed forward with the same instinct that had made him stop his own wedding. "I need you to be my partner publicly for the next few months," Dave said, watching shock replace fear in her features. "Vanessa's family will use today's disaster to damage my business interests if I don't provide alternative explanation for calling off the wedding. If I met someone who made me realize I couldn't go through with an arranged marriage, it becomes romantic gesture rather than insult. You need protection from Marcus that goes beyond legal documents he's already proven he can circumvent." Skylar stared at Dave as though he'd spoken a language she didn't recognize, her mind visibly trying to process a proposal that seemed too convenient to be real. The library felt suddenly smaller with the weight of his offer hanging between them, an arrangement that would solve her immediate problem while creating countless new complications she couldn't begin to calculate. She opened her mouth to speak several times before actual words emerged, asking if he seriously expected her to pretend to be his girlfriend, after knowing her for less than 20 minutes. Dave's expression didn't change as he explained the practical realities with the same calm he'd used discussing business contracts rather than relationship performance. His world ran on perception as much as actual power, the appearance of strength often more valuable than its exercise. A man who canceled his wedding because he fell suddenly and completely for someone else was passionate and decisive. A man who simply called off an arrangement without clear reason was weak and indecisive, vulnerable to challenges from rivals who sensed uncertainty. The logic was cold but undeniable, and Skylar found herself following his reasoning, even as part of her insisted this entire situation was madness that couldn't possibly end well. She asked what exactly being his partner would entail, needing concrete details before her brain could even begin evaluating whether this was survivable insanity or just elaborate trap. Dave leaned back in his chair, with the unconscious confidence of someone accustomed to having his plans accepted as the only reasonable option available. "You'd move into my townhouse here in the historic district. Separate bedroom with locks if that makes you more comfortable. Appearance of cohabitation for anyone watching the house. We'd attend social events together. Charity galas, business dinners, the kinds of obligations that come with my position, and require a partner who can handle scrutiny. You'd continue your bakery work because an authentic detail like that makes the whole story more believable, and I'd ensure Marcus understands you're under protection that extends far beyond what courts can provide. In exchange," Dave continued, ignoring the way Skylar's breathing had become shallow and rapid as the scope of the arrangement crystallized, "I'd invest in your bakery expansion plans and make connections that could turn your delivery operation into the kind of established business your grandmother probably dreamed about." 6 months of public appearances and private discretion, then we have a quiet breakup, where you keep all the business infrastructure built during our relationship. You walk away with security and resources to build the life you want. I get time to restructure alliances without appearing weakened by today's decision. Skylar wanted to find the flaw in his logic, the hidden trap that would make this arrangement something darker than it appeared on the surface. She'd learned with Marcus that offers too good to be true generally were, that generosity often came with prices that weren't discussed until much too late. But Dave was being remarkably transparent about what he wanted and what she'd receive, laying terms out like a business proposal rather than disguising manipulation as romance. The honesty was almost more disturbing than deception would have been because it forced her to make a clear-eyed choice rather than stumbling into danger unknowingly. "What happens if I say no?" she asked, testing whether this was truly an offer or demand disguised as option. Dave met her gaze without the hardening she'd learned to watch for in Marcus. No flicker of anger or calculation about how to change her answer. "I call security to escort you safely off the property, ensure your ex-fiancé is removed from the area, and you go back to your life as it was this morning. The restraining order still won't be worth the paper it's printed on. Marcus will still be watching your roots, but that's not my problem to solve if you don't want my help." The brutal honesty of his assessment made Skylar's stomach clench because she couldn't argue with his reading of her situation. She'd been terrified this morning and would be equally terrified tomorrow unless something fundamental changed in the power dynamics currently trapping her. Dave was offering a nuclear option, protection that came from being associated with someone Marcus wouldn't dare challenge. The cost was her privacy, her autonomy to some degree, and 6 months of her life performing a relationship for public consumption. But she'd already lost her privacy to Marcus's surveillance, already had limited autonomy trying to arrange her schedule around avoiding him, was already performing normalcy every day at work, while panic lived just beneath her skin. At least with Dave's arrangement, the performance would have a defined endpoint and tangible benefits beyond simply surviving until tomorrow. Skylar took a longer drink from the crystal glass, letting the burn of expensive liquor steady nerves that wanted to send her running despite having nowhere safe to run toward. "I have conditions," she heard herself say, voice stronger than she'd expected given the way her hands were still shaking. Dave's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been approval, or simply acknowledgement that she had more spine than her current circumstances suggested. He gestured for her to continue, his full attention focused in a way that was both flattering and slightly intimidating, because it suggested he actually cared what terms she'd propose. "I keep my job at the bakery for as long as I want it. Not just as a prop for your story, but because I need something in my life that's mine and not dependent on this arrangement. Any business investment you make is documented legally as yours, not a gift, so there's no ambiguity about what I owe when this ends. I meet your people and understand exactly who I'm associating with. No surprises about illegal activities that might put me at legal risk. And if I say this isn't working at any point, we develop an exit strategy that doesn't leave me worse off than I am right now." Dave listened to each condition without interruption, his expression giving nothing away until she'd finished speaking, and silence stretched between them while he considered terms he clearly hadn't expected her to propose. Most people in Skylar's position would have simply accepted his offer without negotiation, too desperate or intimidated to push for protections beyond what was initially presented. The fact that she'd found courage to set boundaries despite obvious fear told him more about her character than the previous hour of conversation had revealed. "Agreed on all counts," Dave said finally, reaching into his jacket pocket to retrieve his phone with movements that remained smooth and unhurried, despite the chaos that must still be unfolding elsewhere in the estate. He pulled up a contact and sent a brief message before returning his attention to Skylar, explaining that his attorney would draw up a contract covering everything they'd discussed, plus protections she hadn't thought to request, but would appreciate having documented. The arrangement would be ironclad legally, even if it seemed insane from every other perspective. Skylar felt the reality of what she'd just agreed to settling over her like physical weight. The library suddenly too warm despite the afternoon breeze coming through partially open windows. She was going to move in with a man she'd met less than an hour ago, a man whose last name carried implications she'd spent her entire life avoiding, and pretend to be romantically involved while navigating a world she didn't understand. The alternative was going back to her apartment and waiting for Marcus to escalate beyond following her delivery routes, waiting until the situation became dangerous enough that maybe police would finally take her fears seriously. Dave stood and extended his hand again, this time clearly for a handshake that would seal their agreement, before lawyers made it official with signatures and notarization. Skylar rose on unsteady legs, her hand disappearing into his larger one, as they shook with the formality of business associates, rather than future romantic partners. His grip was firm and brief, releasing her before the contact could become uncomfortable or suggest anything beyond professional transaction they'd just negotiated. "Welcome to my world," Dave said with something that might have been dark humor or simple acknowledgement of the complexity she was entering. His phone buzzed with a response to his earlier message, his expression tightening slightly as he read whatever his second-in-command had reported about the current state of disaster outside the library walls. "We should stay here until my head of security gives the all-clear that your ex has been removed from the property and informed about new boundaries he'd be wise not to cross." Skylar nodded because what else could she do at this point? Committed to an insane plan that felt simultaneously like salvation and potential destruction. She moved to the window overlooking the gardens where her dramatic entrance had occurred, able to see the empty chairs being efficiently cleared by staff, while photographers packed equipment and guests dispersed with enough scandal material to fuel conversations for months. The white aisle runner where she'd fallen was already gone, the ruined cake topper nowhere visible, as though the estate itself was erasing evidence of the disruption that had changed at least 2 lives irrevocably. Behind her, Dave was making additional calls with quiet authority that suggested he was already implementing whatever complex strategy would transform today's disaster into something publicly palatable. Skylar caught fragments of conversation about press statements and family negotiations, the machinery of damage control spinning up with impressive speed. She wondered what Vanessa was doing right now, whether the other woman was devastated or simply furious about the business implications of their canceled wedding, whether she'd accepted this outcome or was already plotting revenge that might eventually reach Skylar. The sun was lower in the sky than it should be, afternoon having slipped toward evening while Skylar's entire life had been reorganized, without her quite noticing the passage of time. She thought about her apartment with its secondhand furniture and temperamental heating, the space that had felt like freedom when she'd first escaped Marcus, but had gradually become prison of a different kind. She thought about her coworker Jenna, who would be finishing her shift soon, and wondering why Skylar hadn't returned from what should have been a quick delivery run. Dave ended his call and came to stand beside her at the window, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that suited him better than Marcus's aggressive designer scents. He said his driver would take her home to pack whatever she needed immediately, security escort to ensure no problems, and she'd be back here before midnight to begin their arrangement. The speed of it all made her head spin. No time to second-guess or let fear talk her out of a decision that was objectively insane from any rational perspective. But maybe insanity was exactly what her situation required, Skylar thought, as she watched the last of the wedding detritus being cleared from gardens that would host some different event next weekend. Maybe you couldn't fight conventional control with conventional resistance, couldn't escape someone like Marcus by following the rules of a system that had already failed to protect her. Maybe the only way forward was to associate herself with someone powerful enough that rules bent in different directions, even if that power came with its own risks and complications she couldn't yet fully comprehend. The drive back to Skylar's apartment happened in a blur of expensive leather seats and tinted windows that turned Savannah's evening streets into a filtered version of reality she'd inhabited just hours earlier. Dave's driver was a quiet professional named Thomas, who drove with the smooth competence of someone trained in evasive maneuvers, but hoping never to use them. The security car following at a discreet distance made Skylar hyper-aware that her life had already transformed into something requiring protection details and strategic planning. Her apartment building looked shabbier than usual when the town car pulled up to its curb, the peeling paint and cracked sidewalk suddenly glaring in contrast to the world she was entering. Thomas opened her door with practiced courtesy that made her feel simultaneously valued and completely out of her depth. The security personnel, 2 men in suits that couldn't quite hide their builds, flanked her entrance to the building with professional vigilance that drew stares from neighbors sitting on their stoops. Jenna was waiting inside the apartment's tiny living room, having used her spare key after Skylar hadn't answered 17 increasingly frantic text messages. Her expression cycled through relief, confusion, and alarm as she took in Skylar's disheveled appearance and the security presence filling their modest space. Before Skylar could begin explaining, Jenna's phone buzzed with a social media notification showing footage of the crashed wedding ceremony that had already gone viral with thousands of shares. The video captured everything: Skylar's stumbling entrance, the cake topper flying through the air, Dave turning with that intense focus, his declaration that the ceremony was over, Comments speculated wildly about who the mystery woman was, and what kind of affair could cause a Moretti to abandon his bride at the altar. Skylar watched herself on Jenna's screen, and barely recognized the terrified woman who'd made that desperate sprint, though only hours separated her from that version of herself. Jenna's questions came rapid fire, demanding to know what had happened, and why Skylar was now apparently connected to organized crime royalty, and whether she'd lost her mind completely. Skylar sank onto their threadbare couch and told the story as efficiently as possible, leaving out details that felt too private to share even with her closest friend. She explained the arrangement with Dave, the contract being drawn up, the need to pack and move tonight, before media attention made everything exponentially more complicated. The practical questions Jenna asked cut through the surreal nature of the situation. Did Skylar trust this man? What happened if he decided the arrangement wasn't working? Had she completely lost sight of her own safety in desperation to escape Marcus? Each question was valid, and Skylar had no good answers beyond admitting that staying in her current situation guaranteed nothing except ongoing fear. At least with Dave's arrangement, she'd have resources to build towards something better, even if the path there was unconventional and potentially dangerous. Jenna helped pack with efficiency, born of practical nature and genuine concern, folding clothes while expressing opinions about wealthy men who thought they could solve problems by throwing money at situations they'd never personally experienced. She wasn't wrong, but she also hadn't spent 2 years watching escape routes close one by one until crashing a wedding felt like reasonable life choice. Skylar packed her grandmother's recipe box with the same care she gave her laptop, both containing dreams that felt fragile enough to shatter if not handled properly. The recipe box held more than just instructions for lemon meringue pie and butter cookies. It contained her grandmother's handwritten notes about adjusting sweetness for humid days and using local pecans instead of imported walnuts, because supporting community mattered. Each card was stained with ingredients from decades of use, the paper soft from being handled by hands that had taught Skylar everything about patience and precision, and turning simple ingredients into something that brought joy. Her grandmother had died 3 years ago, never knowing that her granddaughter would escape a controlling relationship or meet a man whose world operated in shadows, but somehow the recipes felt like guidance from beyond, for navigating impossible choices with integrity and tact. Skylar caught herself wondering what her grandmother would think of Dave, whether the old woman would see past his dangerous reputation to recognize someone who valued honesty, even when lies would be more convenient. The question was unanswerable, but comforting somehow. The mental conversation with someone who'd loved her unconditionally, providing clarity that living advisors couldn't offer, because they were too worried about her safety. Her grandmother had always said that decent people existed in unexpected places, that judging someone by their circumstances rather than their character was lazy, thinking that missed most of life's complexity. The memory steadied Skylar's resolve as she closed the recipe box and placed it carefully in her bag between layers of clothes that would cushion it during transport. The security team did a sweep of the apartment that revealed nothing threatening, but made Skylar realize how exposed she'd been living here with locks that wouldn't stop determined entry. They found the flowers Marcus had sent yesterday, sitting dead in their vase because she'd been too unsettled to maintain them, the cards he'd written sitting in her trash because keeping them felt like holding on to poison. Evidence of stalking that police had deemed insufficient for immediate action, now cataloged by professionals who understood predatory patterns. Thomas loaded her packed bags into the town car's trunk, while Jenna made Skylar promise to call every day and insisted on having Dave's address plus his head of security's direct number. The goodbye hug lasted longer than usual, Jenna whispering that she could still change her mind and come stay at her place instead, despite the cramped quarters. But they both knew Marcus had already shown up at Jenna's building twice, that hiding with friends only expanded the danger's radius to include people Skylar cared about. The drive to Dave's townhouse took them deeper into Savannah's historic district, where properties cost more than Skylar would earn in several lifetimes of bakery work. The streets here were pristine with gas lamps and architectural preservation that made the whole area feel suspended in genteel Southern history. Dave's residence was a 3-story brick masterpiece with black shutters and window boxes that probably cost more to maintain than her monthly rent had been. The interior was exactly what she'd expected, and somehow still surprising. High ceilings with original crown molding, furniture that managed to be both antique and comfortable, art on the walls that might be museum quality for all she knew. A housekeeper named Maria greeted them with warm efficiency, showing no surprise at the unusual circumstances of Skylar's arrival. Her bedroom was on the second floor with an attached bathroom that was larger than her previous living room, decorated in soft blues and creams that felt deliberately calming. Maria explained the household routines with kindness that suggested she'd been briefed on Skylar's circumstances and felt sympathy rather than judgment. Breakfast was available from 6 to 9, though Skylar could request earlier if her bakery shifts required it. Dave typically worked from his home office until noon before heading to various business locations around the city. Evening meals were flexible depending on whether they had social obligations, which Maria predicted would increase significantly now that Skylar was in residence. The bedroom door had a lock, as Dave had promised, the key sitting on the dresser in silent acknowledgement that she might need barriers even in supposedly safe space. Skylar sat on the bed after Maria left and felt the day's events crash over her with delayed intensity. She'd fled Marcus, destroyed a wedding, negotiated a devil's bargain with a man whose world operated by rules she didn't understand, and moved into a house that felt like a museum where she was both guest and exhibit. Her phone buzzed with messages from her boss at the bakery, asking about the delivery and whether she was okay after someone reported seeing her being chased through the historic district. Skylar typed out a response, explaining she'd had an emergency, but would be at work tomorrow as scheduled, not ready to address the larger implications of how her employment would change. The normalcy of work felt important to maintain, a tether to the person she'd been before today's chaos transformed everything. Dave knocked on her door an hour later, with a gentleness that contrasted with his earlier commanding presence at the estate. He'd changed into casual clothes that somehow made him more intimidating rather than less, because they revealed this was who he was without the armor of formal wear. He asked if she'd eaten, and seemed genuinely concerned when she admitted she'd been too unsettled to think about food since breakfast. The kitchen was his domain, apparently, Maria having left for the evening with instructions on where to find prepared meals if needed. Dave moved through the space with surprising competence, heating soup and assembling sandwiches while explaining tomorrow's schedule. His attorney would arrive at 10 with contracts for her review, his publicist at 11 to coordinate their first public statement, his head of security at noon to discuss protocols and emergency procedures she needed to understand. They ate at the kitchen island rather than the formal dining room, the casualness of it making conversation easier than Skylar had anticipated. Dave asked about her bakery work with genuine interest that didn't feel performative, listening as she described her specialization in custom desserts and dream of eventually opening her own shop. He shared details about his legitimate businesses, real estate development, restaurant investments, import-export operations that sounded legal even if she suspected complications beneath the surface. The elephant in the room was his other activities, the organized crime connections that everyone knew about but no one discussed directly in polite society. Dave addressed it without prompting, explaining that he'd inherited a complex organization from his father and was actively working to shift operations toward legitimate enterprises. The process was slow because loyalty and tradition ran deep, but he'd already divested from several activities that crossed lines he wasn't willing to maintain. Skylar appreciated the honesty, even as it confirmed she was now associated with a world her grandmother would have been horrified to know she'd entered. But her grandmother had also taught her that survival sometimes required choices that looked wrong from the outside, but made sense from the inside of impossible situations. She asked if he'd ever had to hurt anyone, needing to know what kind of man she'd agreed to pretend to love. Dave's pause before answering told Skylar more than his eventual words, the careful consideration suggesting he was weighing honesty against self-preservation. He admitted he'd made decisions that resulted in people being hurt, though he'd never personally engaged in violence that wasn't defensive in nature. The distinction felt thin but significant, difference between giving orders and executing them personally. His world operated on deterrence and reputation, the threat of consequences more effective than their actual implementation. Skylar absorbed this information while finishing soup that had gone lukewarm during their conversation, trying to reconcile the man sitting across from her with the implications of what he'd just confessed. She'd expected either complete honesty that would terrify her or deflection that would make trust impossible. What she got was something in between, acknowledgement of moral complexity without excuses or justification. It was more than Marcus had ever given her, his control disguised as care, until the mask had slipped too far to maintain the illusion. The contracts arrived by messenger at 9 despite the late hour, thick documents that would require more than casual reading to fully understand. Dave suggested she take time to review everything thoroughly, hire her own attorney if she wanted independent counsel before signing anything. The offer felt genuine rather than performative, another small indication that he understood power dynamics and was actively trying to balance them despite circumstances that inherently favored his position. Skylar spent 2 hours reading through dense legal language that made her head ache, occasionally asking Dave to clarify specific clauses when terminology exceeded her comprehension. The contracts protected her in ways she hadn't thought to request. Guaranteed monthly stipend separate from business investments, clause preventing him from using their arrangement to control her movements or decisions, explicit timeline with penalties if he tried to extend their agreement beyond 6 months without her consent. The business investment structure was equally detailed, establishing her bakery expansion as legitimate loan with reasonable interest rather than gift that might create obligation or tax complications. Dave had thought through practicalities she'd have missed, protection against both his own potential abuses and external interpretations that might damage her financially. She signed after midnight, with the odd feeling that she was entering a business partnership that happened to involve playing house, rather than romantic relationship masquerading as transaction. Her first morning in the townhouse began at 4:30, when her alarm shattered sleep that had been fragmented anyway by unfamiliar surroundings and racing thoughts. The bakery shift started at 5, and she'd promised her boss she'd be there despite yesterday's chaos. Dave was already awake when she came downstairs, dressed in workout clothes and holding coffee that he offered without comment about the hour. The drive to work happened in a different car than yesterday's town car, this one more modest to avoid drawing attention to the bakery's location. The security detail followed at greater distance, but was clearly present, the awareness of being watched both comforting and claustrophobic. Her co-workers noticed the difference immediately when she arrived. The expensive vehicle dropping her off, the subtle security presence, the way she carried herself with exhaustion that came from life-changing stress rather than simple fatigue. Work provided the normality she'd craved, her hands remembering techniques her grandmother had taught her while her mind could almost pretend nothing had fundamentally changed. She made croissants and decorated cakes, filled custom orders, and chatted with regular customers who had no idea the woman serving them pastries had become reluctant social media sensation overnight. The routine was meditative until her boss pulled her aside during the mid-morning lull to address the elephant everyone was carefully ignoring. Helen had owned the bakery for 20 years and had seen enough of life to recognize trouble when it walked through her door, even when that trouble was trying to hide behind flour-dusted apron and professional smile. She asked directly if Skylar was safe and whether the man from the wedding video was someone she should be worried about. The concern was genuine, and Skylar found herself being more honest than planned, explaining the basics of her arrangement with Dave, while omitting details that would sound insane to anyone not living through them. Helen's response was pragmatic rather than judgmental. She didn't care who Skylar was dating as long as it didn't create problems for the bakery or put other employees at risk. The security presence made her nervous, but she understood the necessity given Marcus's previous harassment. What concerned her more was whether Skylar still wanted this job, or if she was just going through motions until her new wealthy partner decided working was beneath someone in her position. The question cut deep, because Skylar had been wondering the same thing, whether Dave's promises about maintaining her independence would survive first conflict between his world's expectations and her desire for autonomy. She assured Helen the job was important to her beyond just maintaining appearances, that baking was her identity in ways that predated both Marcus and Dave. The conviction in her own voice surprised her, confirmation that some part of herself remained intact despite the chaos of recent days. The afternoon brought her first taste of how thoroughly her life had become public consumption when customers started recognizing her from viral wedding footage. Some were kind with their curiosity, others invasively demanding details she wasn't prepared to share. By closing time, she was emotionally drained from navigating questions that felt like attacks disguised as friendly interest. The security detail's presence suddenly felt less like surveillance and more like necessary buffer between her and a world that believed her life was entertainment. Dave was home when she arrived at the townhouse, working from his office with door open in what felt like deliberate signal that she was welcome to interrupt. She found herself doing exactly that, standing in his doorway and asking how he dealt with constant scrutiny and loss of privacy that came with public profile. His answer was characteristically honest. He'd been raised in this world and knew no different, but he recognized it was jarring for someone thrust into visibility without preparation or choice. They ate dinner together that evening with conversation that flowed more easily than she'd expected, discussing her day at the bakery and his afternoon handling business complications from the canceled wedding. Vanessa's family was making expected trouble, but nothing Dave couldn't manage through a combination of financial concessions and strategic reminders about mutually assured destruction. The casual way he discussed navigating complex social warfare made Skylar realize how completely different their skill sets were. His fluency and power dynamics something she'd need to learn quickly. The routine established itself over the following week with surprising ease considering how artificial its foundation was. Skylar worked her bakery shifts while Dave handled business. They shared evening meals and gradually learned each other's habits and boundaries. He respected her locked bedroom door and never questioned her need for physical space. She learned to read his moods by subtle changes in posture and tone that others might miss. Their first public appearance as a couple happened at a charity gala supporting arts education, the kind of event where Savannah's elite gathered to see and be seen while writing tax-deductible checks. Dave had sent a stylist to the townhouse that afternoon with dresses for Skylar to choose from, each more expensive than her previous month's salary. She'd selected the simplest option in midnight blue that didn't make her feel like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life, though the designer heels were non-negotiable according to the stylist. The gala was held at a restored mansion that made Dave's townhouse look modest, with waiters circulating champagne and hors d'oeuvres that were probably crafted by chefs whose restaurants she couldn't afford to enter. Dave kept his hand on her lower back as they moved through the crowd, the touch possessive enough to be noticeable but light enough not to feel controlling. He introduced her to business associates and social connections with ease that suggested he'd been preparing for this performance as carefully as she had. Skylar played her part better than anticipated, letting Dave take the lead in conversations while contributing enough to seem engaged rather than decorative. She fielded questions about their meeting with the story they'd rehearsed, love at first sight, that made him realize he couldn't marry someone else, romance that had been building before the wedding even if the timing was dramatic. The lies came easier than expected, when Dave's hand on her back felt almost protective, and his attention never wavered even when important people demanded his focus. The local media picked up their relationship within days of the gala appearance, society pages running photos of them together with speculation about whether this was genuine love story or calculated image rehabilitation. Skylar found herself photographed during bakery deliveries, her routine suddenly documented by people who'd never noticed her existence before. The attention was invasive and uncomfortable, but also served practical purpose of making her visibly connected to Dave in ways that broadcast clear warnings to anyone who might consider approaching her. Marcus saw the photos according to the reports Dave's security team provided after monitoring his online activity and known locations. Her ex had initially posted angry commentary on social media about Skylar's supposed gold-digging behavior, but those posts disappeared after Dave's people made clear that continued harassment would have consequences beyond restraining orders. The sudden silence should have been relief, but instead felt ominous, like storm gathering strength before making landfall. Dave's investment in her bakery expansion began transforming from concept to reality with speed that would have been impossible without his resources and connections. He'd found a perfect location for her future shop, a corner space in the historic district with foot traffic and charm that matched her vision exactly. The lease negotiations happened without her involvement, signed and secured before she'd fully processed that this was actually happening. Walking through the empty space with its brick walls and original wood floors made her grandmother's dream feel suddenly achievable instead of perpetually distant. The space had been vacant for 18 months, according to the real estate agent. The previous tenant, a boutique that had failed when the owner's financial backing evaporated during an economic downturn that hit luxury retail hardest. Skylar could see past the dust and outdated fixtures to the potential underneath. The exposed brick would showcase her desserts perfectly. The large windows would flood the space with natural light that made everything look more appetizing. The high ceilings would prevent the claustrophobic feeling that plagued some bakeries. She found herself mentally arranging display cases and planning traffic flow, the practical details grounding her in the reality that this was actually happening rather than just another fantasy she'd entertained during slow shifts at her old job. Dave watched her explore the space with expression that suggested he was seeing something beyond just commercial real estate investment, though Skylar couldn't quite interpret what emotions were playing across his features. He'd removed his jacket and rolled up his shirt sleeves in concession to the space's lack of air conditioning, the casual appearance making him seem more approachable than when he was in full business mode. He asked questions about her vision that demonstrated he'd been paying attention during their dinner conversations about bakery operations, whether she wanted open kitchen concept so customers could watch the baking process, how many seats she envisioned for the small cafe area, what her timeline looked like for developing the menu beyond her grandmother's core recipes. The genuine interest in details that most investors would delegate to managers made Skylar realize he wasn't just funding a business venture, but actively investing in her success as personal priority. The build-out plans were developed in consultation with her input, Dave's architects somehow translating her vague descriptions into detailed designs that captured exactly what she'd imagined. She wanted display cases that showcased baked goods like art, a visible kitchen where customers could watch the creation process, seating that felt intimate rather than commercial. The budget was far beyond what she'd saved over years of delivery work. The difference between what was possible with resources and what she'd have managed alone, stark enough to be slightly humiliating. Dave seemed to understand her discomfort with accepting help that dwarfed anything she could repay, addressing it directly one evening over dinner by pointing out that her success served his interests too. A partner who was building real business was more credible than someone who'd simply moved into his house and started spending his money. The arrangement worked because they both gained tangible benefits, not because he was playing benefactor to grateful recipient. The framing helped her accept support that might otherwise feel like debt she couldn't carry. Her relationship with Jenna provided necessary grounding in reality beyond the increasingly surreal bubble of Dave's world. They met for lunch weekly at places where Jenna could afford to split the bill, maintaining normalcy that Skylar desperately needed. Jenna asked hard questions about whether Skylar was losing herself in the performance, whether she could tell anymore where the act ended, and genuine feeling began. The questions were uncomfortable, because Skylar had been avoiding asking them herself. The truth was that lines were blurring in ways she hadn't anticipated when accepting Dave's proposition. His hand on her back at events had started feeling natural rather than staged. Their evening conversations had depth that went beyond maintaining cover story. She'd caught herself watching him work in his office and feeling something that wasn't part of their contract. The attraction had been immediate that first day, but she'd expected it to fade once familiarity replaced novelty. Instead, it was intensifying into something that scared her with its potential to complicate an already complex situation. Dave gave no clear indication whether he was experiencing similar confusion about boundaries between performance and reality. He was unfailingly courteous and respected every limit she'd established, but there were moments. His laugh at something she'd said, the way he'd started asking about her grandmother's recipes, his genuine pride when showing her the build-out progress at the bakery space. That felt too authentic to be entirely calculated. She told herself she was projecting, seeing what she wanted to see, because loneliness made poor foundation for objective assessment. The bakery space's grand opening was scheduled for 2 months after their arrangement began. Aggressive timeline that was only possible because Dave had thrown unlimited resources at construction and permitting. Skylar worked with his restaurant group's executive chef to develop opening menu that honored her grandmother's recipes, while expanding into territory that would attract upscale clientele. The process was collaborative in ways that challenged her to think bigger than she'd allowed herself to dream, when limited by budget and practical constraints. She hired staff from the original bakery where she'd worked, bringing people she trusted into the new venture, and sharing opportunity that Dave's investment had created. Helen understood this wasn't betrayal, but graduation, supporting Skylar's move toward ownership even as it meant losing good employee. The new shop would need experienced baker to handle early morning production, customer service person who understood the community, delivery driver who could maintain relationships with existing clients while expanding reach. Training new staff revealed leadership capabilities Skylar hadn't known she possessed, confidence emerging from having resources to implement her vision without compromising due to budget limitations. She found herself making decisions with authority that surprised her, no longer second-guessing every choice or seeking permission that wasn't required. Dave noticed the change and commented on it one evening, saying she was becoming the version of herself that had always existed, but hadn't had space to emerge. The observation sat with her for days, because it felt true in ways that were both validating and unsettling. She'd spent so long in survival mode, first under Marcus's control, then in the scramble to establish independence afterward, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to build, rather than just persist. Dave's world was dangerous and morally complex, but it had also given her resources and protection that allowed her to focus on growth instead of constantly defending territory. Her mother called after seeing photos of the bakery space in the local paper's business section. The conversation awkward, because they'd been semi-estranged since Skylar had moved out at 18, to escape household where criticism was primary communication style. Her mother's questions about Dave carried judgment that Skylar had expected, concerns about his reputation, speculation about what he really wanted, warnings about men who seemed too good to be true. The The concern was valid, even if the delivery made Skylar defensive in ways that surprised her. She found herself defending Dave to her mother with conviction that went beyond maintaining their cover story, pointing out that he'd been nothing but respectful and supportive of her goals. Her mother's response was pointed reminder about Marcus, who'd also seemed supportive until control had revealed itself gradually. The comparison stung, because Skylar had been hypervigilant about watching for similar patterns, convinced she'd recognize manipulation after learning those lessons expensively. But Dave's support felt fundamentally different from Marcus's, because it expanded her world, rather than contracting it. He encouraged her bakery work instead of suggesting she didn't need employment. He introduced her to his business associates as partner rather than accessory. He'd given her actual power through business investment and training, rather than making her dependent on his continued approval. The differences mattered, even if her mother couldn't see them from outside the situation. The conversation with her mother planted seeds of doubt that grew in the spaces between certainty and fear. What if Skylar was repeating patterns while telling herself the circumstances were different? What if Dave's sophistication just meant his control was more subtle than Marcus's had been? What if she was falling for someone who would eventually reveal himself as another trap just better disguised? The questions circled through her mind during quiet moments, undermining the fragile confidence she'd been building. Dave found her sitting in the empty bakery space late one evening, when she'd gone there seeking solitude to think through complications that felt impossible to untangle. He didn't ask what was wrong, but simply sat beside her in the unfinished space, his presence somehow comforting rather than intrusive. They sat in silence for several minutes, before Skylar found herself asking if he ever questioned whether they were making a mistake with their arrangement, whether the benefits were worth the complexity they were creating. His answer was characteristically honest. He questioned constantly whether he was being fair to her, whether his world would damage her in ways that outlasted their 6-month agreement, whether his attraction to her was compromising his judgment about what was best for her future. The admission that he was attracted to her landed between them with weight they both felt, acknowledgement of truth they'd been carefully avoiding. Skylar turned to look at him in the dim light filtering through uncovered windows, seeing vulnerability in his expression that she'd never witnessed before. The admission hung in the air between them, with weight that made breathing feel difficult, both aware they'd crossed into territory their contract hadn't accounted for. Skylar's heart was racing in ways that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the realization that she'd been fighting the same attraction, telling herself it was just gratitude or proximity or loneliness. Dave's gaze held hers with intensity that made the empty bakery space feel suddenly intimate despite its commercial proportions, the unfinished walls around them mirroring the incomplete nature of whatever was developing between them. Before either could speak and potentially ruin the moment with words that might demand decisions they weren't ready to make, Dave's phone shattered the silence with a ringtone he'd programmed for emergencies only. His expression shifted instantly from vulnerable to alert, the business persona sliding back into place as he answered with terse acknowledgement. Skylar watched his face darken while he listened to whoever was reporting from the other end, her stomach clenching with instinctive dread before she even knew what the call was about. Marcus had violated the informal understanding that Dave's people had established, showing up at Jenna's apartment building and causing enough of a scene that neighbors had called police. He'd been arrested for trespassing and disorderly conduct, but the real concern was what he'd been shouting during his removal, threats directed at Skylar specifically, and vague implications about Dave's business operations that suggested Marcus had been researching far more than just their relationship. The situation had escalated from personal harassment to potential security threat that required immediate strategic response. Dave ended the call and turned to Skylar with expression that combined apology and calculation, already formulating plans she could see forming behind his eyes. He explained the situation with brutal efficiency, not softening details because he respected her enough to understand she needed full picture to make informed decisions. Marcus had apparently spent the past weeks obsessively documenting Dave's movements and business dealings, compiling information that could cause problems if shared with wrong people or right authorities depending on perspective. The arrest would hold Marcus for 24 hours maximum before bail was posted, giving them extremely limited window to determine what information he'd actually gathered and who he might share it with. Dave's head of security was already pulling surveillance footage and reaching out to contacts within the police department who could provide access to what Marcus had in his possession when arrested. The machinery of Dave's influence was spinning up to address a threat that had transformed from personal annoyance to genuine danger for everyone in their orbit. Skylar felt responsible in ways that made her chest ache with guilt, even though Dave immediately dismissed her attempt to apologize. Marcus's escalation was about his inability to accept loss of control, not about anything Skylar had done or failed to do. But she'd brought this chaos into Dave's life by accepting his protection, and now her ex-fiancé's obsession was potentially exposing Dave's carefully managed operations to scrutiny that could have serious consequences. The weight of that reality pressed down on her with suffocating force. They returned to the townhouse where Dave's inner circle was already gathering in his home office. Marco, his second-in-command, Elena, his attorney, Vincent, his head of security. Skylar had met them all briefly during the past 2 months, but never together in crisis mode. Their professional focus creating atmosphere of controlled urgency that made the stakes unmistakably clear. She started to excuse herself from what was obviously sensitive discussion, but Dave gestured for her to stay with authority that suggested her presence was required, rather than tolerated. The team's assessment was delivered with clinical precision that felt surreal, given they were discussing her ex-fiancé's potential to damage Dave's empire. Marcus had been following not just Skylar, but Dave as well, photographing meetings and documenting patterns that might mean nothing to casual observer, but could be damaging in right context. He'd made contact with a journalist known for investigative pieces on organized crime connections in legitimate business, though it was unclear how much information he'd actually shared versus using as leverage. Vincent recommended immediate action that made Skylar's blood run cold, finding Marcus after his release, and ensuring he understood consequences of sharing information would be permanent rather than temporary. The phrasing was careful, but the implication clear, and Skylar heard herself objecting before conscious thought caught up with instinct. She couldn't be responsible for violence against Marcus no matter how much trouble he was causing. Couldn't live with that weight even if she understood the logic of eliminating threats before they materialized into actual damage. Dave's response surprised everyone in the room by agreeing with Skylar's objection, overriding Vincent's recommendation despite the security chief's visible frustration. There would be no physical harm to Marcus, but that didn't mean they were without options for neutralizing the threat he represented. Elena suggested legal approaches that could tie Marcus up in litigation, expensive enough to drain his resources and attention. Marco proposed business pressure on Marcus's employer that might result in termination and relocation out of Savannah entirely. The discussion that followed revealed the full scope of Dave's influence and the machinery available for destroying someone's life without ever touching them physically. Skylar listened with growing discomfort as they strategized ways to systematically dismantle Marcus's stability, each suggestion more comprehensive than the last. This was the world she'd agreed to enter when accepting Dave's arrangement. The reality of power that operated outside legal frameworks most people depended on for security and justice. Dave watched her face while his team continued planning, reading her discomfort with accuracy that came from 2 months of learning her expressions and responses. He called for a break and asked everyone to give them the room, waiting until they'd filed out before addressing the moral complexity Skylar was clearly struggling with. He acknowledged that his methods existed in gray areas she'd probably never had to navigate, that watching power being wielded this way was different from benefiting from its protection abstractly. But he also pointed out the brutal reality that Marcus had already proven legal systems inadequate for stopping his harassment, that restraining orders and police reports hadn't protected her when she'd tried conventional approaches. Dave's world operated by different rules, because conventional rules had failed people like Skylar repeatedly, leaving them vulnerable to predators who understood how to work within legal limitations. The choice wasn't between moral purity and corruption, but between effective action and continued victimization dressed up as ethical superiority. Skylar wanted to argue, but couldn't find footing for objection that would survive contact with her own experience of how thoroughly legal protections had failed her. She'd filed the right paperwork, reported to the proper authorities, followed every prescribed step for documenting harassment. None of it had stopped Marcus from tracking her movements, or showing up at her friend's building, or gathering information he could weaponize. Dave's methods might be ethically questionable, but they were effective in ways that mattered for actual survival. She asked what would happen to Marcus if they proceeded with the plans being discussed, needing to understand the full scope of consequences before implicitly endorsing actions taken in her name. Dave's answer was characteristically honest. Marcus would lose his job through pressure applied to his employer about liability concerns, would face multiple lawsuits that would drain his savings and make legal defense untenable, would find himself unable to secure new employment in Savannah, because word would spread through networks that mattered. Effectively, they would make staying in the city untenable without ever directly threatening him. The plan was devastatingly comprehensive, and Skylar recognized it as mercy compared to what Vincent had initially proposed, even as it still represented destruction of Marcus's life as he knew it. She thought about the man she'd once believed she loved, the person he'd been before control had revealed itself as his primary value. Part of her grieved for what could have been if he'd been different, but larger part recognized that protecting herself and Dave required being willing to fight back with tools that actually worked, rather than just felt righteous. Her consent was implied rather than explicit when Dave called his team back into the office and gave approval to proceed with legal and business pressure campaigns. Elena began making calls to set litigation in motion, while Marco reached out to contacts who could apply pressure to Marcus's employer discreetly. Vincent looked disappointed that his more direct approach had been rejected, but moved efficiently to implement the strategy Dave had endorsed. Watching them work was like seeing well-oiled machine transform planning into action with frightening speed. The group dispersed near midnight, leaving Dave and Skylar alone in his office, surrounded by evidence of power. She was only beginning to comprehend fully. She felt simultaneously protected and complicit, grateful for his intervention, and disturbed by her willingness to endorse methods she'd have condemned from outside perspective. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting, and when Dave asked if she was okay, she found herself admitting she wasn't sure what okay even meant anymore in context of their arrangement. He moved closer with careful deliberation that gave her time to step back if she wanted distance. But Skylar found herself staying in place as he reached up to touch her face with gentleness that contrasted sharply with the calculated destruction they'd just planned. This was the duality of his nature, capable of dismantling someone's life with phone calls, while also treating her with tenderness that felt genuine, despite all the reasons she had to question whether anything between them was real. The contradiction should have terrified her, but instead it made him feel human in ways that simple goodness never could. The kiss happened without clear initiation from either party, more like gravity pulling them together than conscious decision being made by individuals who should know better. Skylar's hands found his shirt while his fingers threaded through her hair, 2 months of tension and attraction and performed intimacy, finally finding physical expression that had nothing to do with their public arrangement. The kiss was hungry and desperate with an edge of inevitability, both of them acknowledging through action what words would have complicated beyond salvaging. Dave pulled back first, though his hands remained on her face, searching her expression for regret or panic or any sign that she felt pressured by circumstances that inherently favored his position of power. What he found instead was Skylar's own desire reflected back at him, her breathing as unsteady as his, and her pupils dilated in ways that had nothing to do with the office lighting. She was the one who closed the distance for a second kiss that confirmed the first hadn't been mistake or moment of weakness, but rather admission of what had been building since he'd turned around at his ruined wedding. They moved towards the bedroom, the professional distance they had maintained for months, finally collapsing under the weight of genuine emotion. The contract had specified separate bedrooms and boundaries, rules they were willingly setting aside as the reality of their feelings finally overtook the logic of their arrangement. Skylar should have felt guilty or worried about complicating an already complex situation, but as they crossed the threshold together, all she felt was right in ways that defied rational analysis. In the quiet that followed, the expensive silence of the room felt somehow more honest than months of performed relationship for public consumption. Dave's hand rested gently on her shoulder, while her head rested on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Neither spoke because words would require addressing how completely the lines had blurred, and what it meant for an arrangement that had been working precisely because they'd maintained clear boundaries between performance and reality. The morning arrived with sunlight streaming through windows Dave had forgotten to close, illuminating a scene that was undeniably intimate in ways their contract had explicitly prohibited. Skylar woke first, and experienced several seconds of disorientation before memory supplied context that brought both satisfaction and concern. She'd slept with Dave, thoroughly violated the professional distance that had made their arrangement sustainable, and had no clear idea how to navigate whatever came next. Dave stirred as she tried to slip from the bed without waking him, his arm tightening around her waist in unconscious hold that suggested even sleeping he was reluctant to let her go. His eyes opened with alertness that came from years of needing to wait quickly and assess situations, taking in her presence beside him and the undeniable shift in their dynamic, with an expression that cycled through several emotions before settling on something that looked almost like contentment. "Morning," he said quietly, the simple greeting somehow carrying weight of everything that remained unspoken between them. Skylar responded with equal simplicity, unwilling to dive immediately into analysis of how thoroughly they'd complicated their lives the previous night. The practicality of needing to get ready for work, provided excuse to extract herself from bed and situation that required conversation neither was prepared for. Dave let her go without protest, though his eyes followed her gathering scattered clothes with intensity that suggested their physical relationship was far from one-time occurrence, born of stress and proximity. The bakery provided refuge in routine, her hands remembering recipes, while her mind tried to process how dramatically her arrangement with Dave had shifted. She'd entered his world to escape Marcus and build her business, carefully maintaining emotional distance from a man whose life was so different from hers that real relationship seemed impossible. But somewhere between charity galas and dinner conversations and his genuine investment in her dreams, the performance had become reality that neither had acknowledged until it could no longer be denied. Jenna noticed immediately that something had changed when they met for their weekly lunch, reading Skylar's expression with the accuracy of true friendship that couldn't be fooled by careful neutrality. The direct question came before Skylar had even opened her menu. "You slept with him, didn't you?" Not accusation, but observation stated with certainty that made denial pointless. Skylar confirmed with a nod that felt like confession, waiting for the lecture about poor judgment in complicated situations. Instead, Jenna asked if Skylar had feelings for Dave beyond the physical attraction that anyone with eyes could see existed between them. The question cut to the core of what Skylar had been avoiding examining too closely, forcing her to acknowledge that yes, she'd developed feelings that went far beyond what their arrangement required. She cared about his well-being, found herself thinking about him during mundane moments, felt genuine happiness when his business deals worked out favorably. The admission felt dangerous because caring made her vulnerable in ways she'd sworn to avoid after Marcus. But Dave wasn't Marcus despite her mother's warnings about repeating patterns, and the differences mattered even if the surface similarities of wealthy men offering protection were superficially comparable. Dave expanded her world while Marcus had contracted it. Dave respected her boundaries even when crossing them would serve his interests. Dave had given her actual power through business investment, rather than making her dependent on his continued approval for survival. The comparison felt important, even as Jenna pointed out that 2 months wasn't long enough to truly know someone, especially when the foundation was performance rather than organic development. The conversation continued in circles of logic that felt both valid and incomplete, Jenna's concerns rooted in genuine care, while Skylar's defenses came from not wanting to admit she might be making a mistake that would cost more than she could afford. They parted with usual affection but unusual tension, Skylar's certainty about her decisions weakened by questions that had been easier to dismiss when they existed only in her own mind. External validation would have been welcome, but Jenna's skepticism forced examination that was uncomfortable but probably necessary. Dave texted that afternoon asking if they could talk that evening, message that felt loaded with implications about conversations they'd been avoiding. Skylar agreed, though anxiety built throughout her remaining work hours about what he might say, whether he regretted what had happened, whether he wanted to modify their arrangement, whether he'd decided the complication wasn't worth maintaining their agreement. Each possibility carried its own form of dread, confirmation that she was far more invested in their relationship than their contract justified. He was waiting in the kitchen when she arrived home, the domesticity of the scene striking her with force because it felt genuine rather than staged. Dave had cooked dinner which was unusual enough to signal the conversation's importance, setting the table with care that suggested he was nervous too. They ate first in silence that was almost comfortable, years of practiced social performance having taught them both that difficult conversations required proper staging. Finally, Dave set down his fork and met her eyes with directness that was simultaneously relieving and terrifying. "Last night wasn't mistake or moment of weakness for me," he said with characteristic honesty that left no room for misinterpretation. "I've been attracted to you since the moment you crashed my wedding, and spending these months with you has made it clear that attraction is the least complicated part of what I feel. I'm aware our arrangement has timeline and terms, but I need you to know that my feelings have evolved beyond what the contract specified." Skylar absorbed this confession, while her heart hammered against her ribs hard enough that she wondered if he could hear it from across the table. She'd expected many possible openings to this conversation, but not the vulnerability in his admission, the way he'd laid out his position without demanding reciprocation, or trying to use their power imbalance to influence her response. The honesty deserved equal honesty in return, even if the words felt dangerous to speak aloud. "I didn't want to have feelings for you," she admitted in voice that shook slightly, despite her effort to maintain composure. "This was supposed to be business arrangement that benefited us both. Temporary solution to immediate problems with clear endpoint. But you've been kind and respectful, and genuinely invested in my dreams in ways that made it impossible not to care. I'm terrified I'm repeating patterns with different person, that I'm mistaking your protection for partnership in ways that will hurt me eventually. But I also can't deny that what I feel for you goes beyond what our contract requires. The admission hung between them with weight that felt simultaneously liberating and binding, acknowledgement that they'd moved far beyond the transaction that had brought them together. Dave reached across the table to take her hand, his grip firm without being controlling, thumb brushing across her knuckles in gesture that was becoming familiar. He acknowledged her fear was valid given her history, promised he couldn't guarantee never hurting her, but could promise to be honest about his intentions and limitations. The modesty of the promise made it more credible than grand declarations would have been. They agreed to continue their arrangement while acknowledging it had evolved into something neither could fully define yet, removing the pretense that their relationship was purely performative while maintaining the practical protections that had brought them together. The 6-month timeline still existed, but felt less like expiration date and more like checkpoint, where they'd reevaluate based on what had developed organically. It wasn't fairy tale romance, but it was honest in ways that mattered more than romantic gestures ever could. Marcus's legal troubles materialized with speed that confirmed Elena's competence and Dave's reach into systems that supposedly operated independently of outside influence. The lawsuits Elena had filed were comprehensive enough to require legal defense that would cost Marcus more than his annual salary, while the pressure Marco had applied to his employer resulted in termination based on fabricated performance concerns that were technically legal if morally questionable. Within 2 weeks of their strategy session, Marcus was unemployed, financially strained, and facing legal battles that would consume whatever resources remained. The journalist who Marcus had contacted published nothing after receiving visit from Dave's attorney, making clear that any story based on Marcus's information would result in litigation for defamation that publication couldn't afford. Whether the threats were legally valid mattered less than their effectiveness in convincing the journalist that pursuing the story would cost more than it was worth. Skylar tried not to think too hard about how easily truth could be suppressed when the right pressure was applied to the right vulnerable points in systems supposedly designed to expose wrongdoing. Marcus left Savannah 3 weeks after his arrest, relocating to Atlanta where Dave's influence was present but less concentrated, where he could potentially rebuild life outside the shadow of the destruction that had been orchestrated against him. Skylar felt relief at his departure, mixed with complicated guilt about the methods that had made it happen. She'd wanted safety, but hadn't fully reckoned with what safety would cost in moral compromise and complicity in using power that shouldn't exist in functional society, but undeniably did. The bakery's grand opening happened on a Saturday morning in May, when Savannah's weather was perfect, and the historic district was crowded with tourists and locals ready to embrace new establishment. Skylar stood behind the counter she'd dreamed about for years, selling pastries made from her grandmother's recipes to people who had no idea how improbable this moment was given where she'd been 6 months ago. Dave was there, but maintaining distance that allowed this to be her victory rather than their project. His pride visible in every glance, even as he gave her space to own the achievement. The shop was successful beyond initial projections, becoming destination for both tourists seeking authentic Southern baking and locals who appreciated the quality that came from someone who actually cared about the craft. Skylar hired additional staff as demand exceeded what she could produce alone, training bakers in techniques her grandmother had taught her, and finding satisfaction in sharing knowledge that had been passed down through generations. The business was hers in ways that mattered beyond legal ownership, built on her skills and vision even if Dave's resources had made it possible. Their relationship continued evolving outside the public eye, becoming something that felt increasingly like partnership rather than performance or transaction. Dave attended industry events that bored him because Skylar wanted his support. While she accompanied him to family obligations that were tense with politics, she was still learning to navigate. They fought occasionally about his overprotectiveness or her reluctance to accept help, even when it would make her life easier. Arguments that felt productive rather than destructive, because they came from genuine investment in each other's well-being. The 6-month mark of their arrangement came and went without the formal dissolution they'd contracted for, neither mentioning the anniversary, because addressing it would require decisions they weren't ready to make. The contract had served its purpose in getting them safely to a place where something real could develop, but maintaining it felt increasingly absurd, given how thoroughly their actual relationship had diverged from its terms. Elena suggested updating the documentation to reflect reality, but neither Dave nor Skylar felt compelled to formalize what was working precisely because it remained somewhat undefined. Vanessa appeared at the bakery one afternoon during a lull in customer traffic, her presence causing immediate tension that Skylar tried to disguise behind professional courtesy. The former bride looked as polished as she had at the wedding that never was, though her expression carried calculation rather than lingering hurt. She ordered coffee and pastry with politeness that felt performative, establishing that she wasn't there to cause a scene before getting to whatever point had brought her to Skylar's business. The conversation that followed was surprisingly civil, given the circumstances of their first encounter, Vanessa explaining that she'd come to deliver message rather than settle personal scores. Dave's decision to end their wedding had actually liberated her from arrangement she'd felt equally trapped by, allowing her to pursue relationship with someone her family would never have approved while she was designated from a ready alliance. She was grateful in her own way for the dramatic exit that had given her cover to redirect her own life, but she also warned that Dave's world was more complicated than Skylar might understand, even after months of proximity to it, that his efforts to legitimize operations would face resistance from old guard who valued tradition over his vision of evolution. Vanessa had grown up in similar world and knew the costs of association, even when the person you cared about had best intentions. The warning was delivered without judgment, but with certainty born of experience, older sister offering wisdom that younger woman might not want to hear but needed to consider. Skylar thanked her for the concern and honesty, acknowledging the validity of warnings without committing to any particular course of action. Vanessa left with parting observation that Skylar was stronger than she'd initially appeared, that maybe she actually could handle the complexity of Dave's world in ways that Vanessa herself had never wanted to attempt. The conversation stayed with Skylar for days, not changing her feelings, but adding nuance to understanding of what she'd chosen by staying with Dave past their contract's expiration. Dave proposed on the anniversary of their first meeting, exactly 1 year after Skylar had crashed his wedding in desperate flight from Marcus. The proposal happened at the estate where they'd met, in the library where they'd negotiated their original arrangement, with honesty that had characterized their entire relationship. He admitted he'd originally intended to wait longer, but realized he was delaying because he was afraid of her answer, that confidence in business hadn't translated to confidence in personal relationships after a lifetime of transactional connections. Skylar's acceptance came with stipulations that made Dave laugh, even as he agreed to every term. She wanted prenuptial agreement protecting her business as separate property, wanted ceremony that was private rather than social spectacle, wanted his promise that he'd continue supporting her autonomy, even when it would be easier to make decisions for her. The negotiations felt appropriate given how they'd started. Romance built on foundation of honest transaction rather than pretending practical considerations didn't matter when they absolutely did. The wedding happened 3 months later with only close friends and family present. Ceremony in the townhouse garden that had become home to them both. Skylar wore simple dress she'd chosen herself, rather than designer gown selected by stylists, carried flowers from the market, rather than elaborate arrangements from exclusive florists. Dave wore suit that wasn't custom, but fit him perfectly anyway. His vows delivered with conviction that made even his most skeptical associates believe this unlikely partnership might actually work. The bakery expanded to second location 2 years later, Skylar's grandmother's dream growing beyond anything the woman could have imagined when teaching young girl to bake in her small kitchen. Skylar divided time between both shops, while Dave continued working to transform his inherited operations into businesses that could survive scrutiny and exist in legitimate economy. Their lives remained complicated by his world's realities, but were also richer for the unlikely connection that had started with desperate crash through wedding ceremony gates. Marcus had eventually settled in Atlanta and remarried. According to reports, Dave's people continued monitoring, despite Skylar's protests that surveillance was unnecessary. She didn't wish him harm, but felt no obligation to track his life, content knowing he'd moved on and left her to build her own future. The restraining order had expired years ago, but Marcus never attempted contact again, whether from genuine growth or understanding that consequences of renewed harassment would be severe, remained unclear and ultimately irrelevant. Dave and Skylar's story became local legend in Savannah's social circles, told and retold, with details that grew more dramatic with each telling, until the truth was buried under layers of speculation and embellishment. Some versions painted Skylar as gold digger, who'd engineered the whole situation. Others portrayed Dave as white knight, who'd rescued damsel in distress. The real story was more complex and human than either narrative allowed. Two people who'd found each other in circumstances neither would have chosen, building something genuine from foundation of practical necessity and honest recognition of mutual benefit. On their 5th anniversary, Dave gave Skylar keys to commercial kitchen space she'd been eyeing for possible bakery school, where she could teach techniques her grandmother had taught her. The gift was perfect, because it supported her dreams while acknowledging she'd already achieved the success they'd originally contracted for, that their relationship had moved beyond transaction into territory where supporting each other's growth was simply what partners did. They stood together in the empty kitchen that smelled of possibility and sawdust, planning future that felt secure in ways that had nothing to do with money or protection, and everything to do with genuine partnership built on honesty and mutual respect. The space they'd created together wasn't perfect because perfect didn't exist outside fairy tales and manufactured social media narratives. They still fought about his overprotective instincts and her stubborn independence, still navigated the complexity of his world's moral ambiguity and her need for clear ethical boundaries. But they'd built something real from circumstances that should have been temporary, proving that sometimes the most unlikely foundations could support structures that lasted precisely because they'd been built with honesty about limitations and possibilities both. Thank you all for following this story. If you've been enjoying it, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything and helps me continue creating these stories. I'd love to hear which moment resonated with you most, whether it was Skylar's brave entrance at the wedding or the way Dave chose honesty over easy deception. Your engagement keeps these narratives alive, so drop a comment and let's build this community together.